I never imagined that the worst betrayal of my life would come from the person I shared a bedroom with for 18 years. My name is Emma Richardson. I'm 27 years old, and I live in a modest 2-bedroom apartment in Portland, Oregon, where the rain seems to wash away everything except the memories that refuse to fade. The Pacific Northwest has always been my home, with its evergreen trees that tower over the highways, the smell of fresh coffee that permeates every street corner, and the constant drizzle that makes you question whether you actually need an umbrella, or if you've just become numb to being perpetually damp. I work as a junior graphic designer at a small marketing agency downtown, the kind of place where everyone has a vintage bicycle and brings their rescue dog to work on Fridays. My salary isn't much, just enough to cover rent, groceries, and the occasional splurge at Powell's Books when I need to escape reality between the pages of someone else's story. My sister Melissa is 3 years younger than me, and we've always had what I thought was a close relationship, the kind where you share secrets, borrow each other's clothes without asking, and stay up late talking about your dreams and fears. She moved in with me 6 months ago after breaking up with her previous boyfriend, a guy named Derek, who worked at a craft brewery and had an inexplicable collection of vintage concert posters that he valued more than their relationship. Melissa was heartbroken, crying on my couch for weeks, eating her way through pints of salt and straw ice cream while I rubbed her back and assured her that better days were coming. I gave her the second bedroom, the one with the window that looks out onto the street where you can watch the Max train rumble by every 15 minutes. She promised it would only be temporary, just until she got back on her feet, found a new job, saved some money. I didn't mind. She was my sister, and that's what family does. 2 months after moving in, Melissa met Travis at a friend's backyard barbecue in southeast Portland, one of those hipster gatherings where everyone brings locally sourced kale salads and argues passionately about the best food carts in the city. Travis was different from her usual type, older by almost 10 years, with slicked back hair that looked perpetually greasy, a thin mustache that belonged in a 1970s crime drama, and a leather jacket he wore regardless of the weather. He worked in what he vaguely described as sales, though I never got a straight answer about what exactly he sold. There was something about him that made my skin crawl from the first moment we met, the way his eyes would scan our apartment like he was cataloging everything for future reference, the way he spoke to Melissa with a mixture of charm and condescension that made me uncomfortable. But my sister was smitten, completely and utterly infatuated in that way that makes rational people do irrational things. Within 3 weeks, Travis was practically living with us, though he never officially moved in, and certainly never contributed to rent or utilities. He'd show up at odd hours, sometimes early in the morning, sometimes late at night, always with some story about a deal he was working on or a connection he had to meet. The apartment started to feel crowded, not just physically but energetically, like his presence was filling up space that wasn't his to occupy. I'd come home from work exhausted, my eyes strained from staring at design mock-ups all day, only to find Travis sprawled on my couch, eating my food, watching my television. When I gently suggested to Melissa that maybe Travis should spend more time at his own place, wherever that was, she got defensive, accusing me of being jealous that she'd found someone while I was still single. That stung more than I wanted to admit, because she was right about one thing. I was single, and I had been for almost 2 years since my last relationship ended in spectacular fashion, when I discovered my ex-boyfriend had been maintaining an entire second relationship with a barista from a coffee shop in Northwest Portland. But I wasn't jealous of Melissa and Travis. I was worried about her, about the way she seemed to be changing, becoming more secretive, more defensive, more willing to make excuses for behavior that clearly crossed boundaries. She stopped talking to me the way she used to, stopped asking about my day, stopped caring about anything except Travis and whatever schemes he was cooking up in that calculating mind of his. The wedding dress was the most important thing I owned, not in terms of monetary value, but in terms of what it represented. I'd bought it 8 months earlier when I was engaged to James, a high school history teacher who coached the varsity basketball team, and had the kind of steady, reliable presence that made you feel safe. We met at a friend's wedding, ironically enough, bonding over our mutual discomfort with the electric slide and our shared love of old Coen Brothers movies. James proposed on a hiking trail in the Columbia River Gorge, down on one knee beside Multnomah Falls, while tourists took pictures and a group of teenagers cheered. It was perfect, exactly what I'd always imagined, and when I said yes, I meant it with every fiber of my being. I found the dress at a small bridal boutique in the Pearl District, The kind of place where they serve you champagne and treat you like you're the only bride in the world. It was ivory-colored, not pure white, with delicate lace sleeves and a flowing skirt that made me feel like I was floating when I walked. The moment I put it on, I knew it was the one. My mother cried, my best friend Sarah gasped, and even the boutique owner, a woman named Patricia, who'd been in the business for 30 years, said it was like the dress had been made specifically for me. It cost $2,000, which was more than I'd ever spent on a single item in my life. I put it on 3 different credit cards and committed to eating ramen and peanut butter sandwiches for the next 6 months to pay it off. It was worth it. That dress represented hope, future, love, everything I believed was coming my way. But then James and I broke up. It happened gradually, and then all at once, the way these things often do. He started pulling away, becoming distant, always having an excuse for why he couldn't meet up, why he was too tired to talk, why he needed space. I tried to be understanding, tried to give him what he needed, while also holding on to the relationship I'd thought we were building. Eventually, he sat me down in his cramped apartment that always smelled like old textbooks and told me he wasn't ready for marriage, that he'd gotten caught up in the momentum of the relationship without really thinking about what it meant to commit to forever. He was crying, genuinely upset, and that somehow made it worse because I couldn't even hate him properly. He was just a scared person who'd realized something important about himself before it was too late. We ended it amicably, or as amicably as you can end an engagement, and I packed up the pieces of the life I'd been planning. I kept the dress, even though the wedding wasn't happening, even though there was no groom waiting at the end of an aisle. I couldn't bear to part with it. It hung in my closet in a protective garment bag, a ghost of a future that never materialized. Some of my friends suggested I sell it, that I could recoup some of the money and move on emotionally, but I wasn't ready. Maybe I was being sentimental. Maybe I was holding on to false hope. But that dress was mine, and it represented a version of myself I didn't want to completely let go of, the version who believed in happy endings and forever. It was a Tuesday in late October when I discovered the dress was gone. Portland was experiencing one of those rare stretches of sunny autumn weather, the kind where the leaves turn brilliant shades of orange and gold, and the air smells like wood smoke and possibility. I'd taken the day off work to run errands, things that had been piling up for weeks, dry cleaning that needed to be picked up, bills that needed to be paid in person, a dentist appointment I'd been rescheduling for months. When I got home around 3 in the afternoon, the apartment was empty, which was unusual because Melissa had been working from home lately, doing some kind of online customer service job that mostly involved her wearing pajamas and typing aggressively at her laptop. I decided to organize my closet, something I'd been meaning to do for ages. My clothes were a chaotic mess of work outfits, casual weekend wear, and impulse purchases I'd made during late-night online shopping sessions when I was feeling particularly lonely. I was sorting through everything, making piles for donation. When I reached for the garment bag that held my wedding dress, my hand grasped at empty space. I looked again, thinking maybe I'd moved it and forgotten. Maybe it had shifted to a different part of the closet. I pulled everything out, every dress, every coat, every garment I owned, creating a mountain of fabric on my bedroom floor. The dress wasn't there. The garment bag wasn't there. It was simply gone. Panic set in immediately, that cold feeling that starts in your chest and spreads through your entire body until your fingers are tingling and your breath comes in short gasps. I tore through the entire apartment, checking every closet, every storage space, even looking in ridiculous places like under the bathroom sink and behind the couch, as if a wedding dress could somehow teleport itself into impossible locations. Nothing. I called Melissa, my voice shaking, asking if she'd seen it, if she'd moved it, if she had any idea where it could be. She didn't answer. I called again, and again. On the 4th call, she finally picked up, her voice irritated and impatient. When I asked about the dress, there was a pause, a silence that stretched too long, the kind of pause that tells you everything before the words even come. Then she said, casual as if she was mentioning she'd borrowed a sweater, that she and Travis had sold it. They'd taken it to a consignment store that specialized in wedding dresses, someplace out in Beaverton that gave them $800 cash. No questions asked. She said it like it was nothing, like she'd done me a favor by clearing out my closet. When I started yelling, demanding to know how she could possibly think that was okay, she got defensive. She said I wasn't using it, that it was just taking up space, that they needed the money, because Travis had some bills that needed paying, and she was trying to help him out. She said I was being selfish, holding on to something from a relationship that was over, that I needed to move on anyway, and this was actually good for me. I couldn't breathe. I literally could not get air into my lungs. My sister, the person I'd helped through breakups and job losses and family drama, had stolen my wedding dress and sold it to finance whatever scheme her sketchy boyfriend was running. I hung up on her, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped my phone. I tried to call the consignment store she'd mentioned, but when I finally got through, they told me the dress had already been sold, purchased by someone earlier that same day. They couldn't give me any information about the buyer due to privacy policies. And no, they couldn't reverse the sale because all transactions were final. The woman on the phone sounded sympathetic but firm, like she'd dealt with similar situations before and knew there was nothing she could do. I spent that night crying in a way I hadn't cried since the breakup with James, maybe even more intensely because this felt like a different kind of loss. James breaking up with me was painful, but it was his choice to make about his own life. This was theft. This was betrayal. This was my own sister choosing her boyfriend over me, over our relationship, over basic human decency. When Melissa came home around midnight with Travis in tow, both of them smelling like beer and cigarettes, I confronted them in the living room. Travis had the audacity to laugh, actually laugh, saying I was being overdramatic about a dress, that material possessions didn't matter, that I needed to calm down. Melissa stood behind him, literally physically behind him like he was a shield, and told me I was overreacting, that families help each other, and this was me refusing to help when they needed it. I told them both to get out. I said Melissa had 1 week to find another place to live and that Travis was never welcome in my apartment again. Travis took a step toward me, his face hardening in a way that made my heart pound with genuine fear, but Melissa pulled him back, whispering something I couldn't hear. They left, slamming the door behind them hard enough that my neighbor knocked on the wall. I locked every lock, fastened the chain, and then slid down the door onto the floor, crying until I had nothing left inside me but emptiness and anger. The next few days were a blur of misery and logistics. I called my parents, who lived in Eugene, about 2 hours south of Portland. My father, Jack, was a retired electrician who spent most of his time working in his garage on various projects, building birdhouses and fixing old radios and generally keeping his hands busy because that's how he'd always processed the world. My mother, Linda, was a part-time librarian with a soft voice and a tendency to see the best in everyone, sometimes to a fault. When I told them what happened, there was a long silence on the other end of the phone. My mother made sympathetic sounds, saying she couldn't believe Melissa would do such a thing, that there must be some misunderstanding. My father said only 3 words in his low, gravelly voice that always reminded me of distant thunder. "That's not right." And then he was quiet. I also told my best friend, Sarah, who immediately offered to come over with wine and ice cream, and possibly a baseball bat to have a conversation with Travis. Sarah worked as a nurse at Oregon Health and Science University, dealing with trauma patients and emergency situations, so she had a particular way of cutting through nonsense and getting to the heart of things. She came over that Friday night, bringing an expensive bottle of red wine and a pint of Marionberry ice cream from a local creamery. We sat on my couch, rain pattering against the windows in that constant Portland way, and she let me rant for 2 hours straight without interruption. Then she said what I needed to hear, that I had every right to be furious, that Melissa's behavior was unacceptable, that Travis was clearly manipulating her, but also that I couldn't let this consume me, that I had to find a way to move forward, even if I never got the dress back. Melissa moved out 4 days after our confrontation, taking her things while I was at work, so we wouldn't have to face each other. She left her key on the kitchen counter with no note, no apology, no acknowledgement of what she'd done. The apartment felt simultaneously emptier and more spacious, like I could finally breathe fully in my own home. But the relief was mixed with profound sadness, because I'd lost more than a dress. I'd lost the relationship with my sister, or at least the version of it I'd believed existed. I kept wondering if there had been signs I'd missed, red flags that indicated she was capable of this kind of betrayal. Maybe I'd been too trusting, too willing to see her as the little sister I'd protected and cared for, rather than the adult woman she'd become, capable of making terrible choices. 2 weeks later, on a Saturday afternoon when the rain had finally let up and weak November sunlight was struggling through the clouds, I decided to go thrifting. It's something I did occasionally, hunting through the racks at Goodwill or Value Village for vintage band t-shirts and old Levi's jackets, finding treasures in other people's discards. There was a Value Village on Southeast Powell Boulevard that I liked. A huge warehouse-style store that smelled like mothballs and old perfume, where you could easily spend 3 hours browsing through endless racks of clothes, shelves of dishes, bins of miscellaneous items that ranged from broken electronics to vintage typewriters. I needed to get out of my apartment, needed to do something normal that didn't involve dwelling on my situation. I was half-heartedly looking through the women's formal wear section, not really expecting to find anything interesting, when I saw it. At first I thought I was hallucinating, that my grief had somehow manifested into a visual illusion. But no, hanging there between a hideous peach-colored bridesmaid dress from the 1980s and a stained prom gown was my wedding dress, my dress. I recognized it instantly, intimately, every detail from the specific pattern of the lace to the tiny pearl buttons that ran down the back. There was even a small mark near the hem where I'd accidentally stepped on it during my fitting, and the seamstress had repaired it so skillfully you could barely see it. The price tag said $35. My hands were shaking as I reached for it, pulling it off the rack and holding it against my body like I was afraid it might disappear again. $35. My $2,000 dress, the one I'd gone into debt for, the one that represented so much more than fabric and thread, was being sold at a thrift store for the price of a cheap dinner. I felt sick. I felt angry. I felt vindicated because this proved I wasn't being overdramatic. This was real. This dress was important enough to track down and reclaim. I clutched it to my chest and headed straight for the checkout, not even bothering to look at anything else. That's when I heard his voice, familiar and grounded, and exactly what I needed in that moment. "Emma?" I turned to see my father standing near the electronics section, holding what appeared to be an old turntable he'd probably been examining with his usual meticulous attention to detail. He was wearing his standard uniform of worn jeans, a flannel shirt, and a baseball cap from a local hardware store, his weathered face showing surprise at seeing me there. My father came to Portland maybe once every few months, usually to visit a specific hardware store that carried parts he couldn't find in Eugene, or to see an old friend from his working days. Running into him here now, while I was holding my stolen and recovered wedding dress, felt like the universe finally throwing me a break. He walked over, his eyes moving from my face to the dress I was clutching, and I saw his expression shift as he put the pieces together. My father had always been a man of few words, someone who expressed love through actions rather than lengthy conversations, who fixed things and built things and showed up when you needed him rather than talking about emotions. He looked at the price tag, looked at my face, which I'm sure showed every ounce of pain and anger and relief I was feeling, and then he looked toward the front of the store where Value Village employees were processing donations and managing checkouts. "Follow me," he said simply, and I did. We walked to the customer service desk, my father moving with the kind of quiet purpose that made people pay attention without him having to raise his voice. He asked to speak to a manager, and when a woman in her 40s with tired eyes and a name tag that read Deborah appeared, he explained the situation in his straightforward, no-nonsense way. He told her that this dress had been stolen from his daughter, sold without her permission to a consignment store, and then presumably sold to Value Village through some chain of transactions. He didn't yell or make threats. He simply stated facts in that calm, steady voice that somehow carried more weight than any amount of shouting could. Deborah listened, her expression shifting from skeptical to sympathetic as my father talked. She asked if I had any proof of ownership, which stumped me for a moment until I remembered that I'd taken about 100 photos when I first got the dress, excitedly texting them to everyone I knew. I pulled out my phone with shaking hands and scrolled through my camera roll, finding the photos from 10 months earlier, me smiling in the bridal shop, the dress from every conceivable angle, close-ups of the lace detail, and the buttons. Deborah compared the photos to the dress I was holding, noting the distinctive features and that small repair near the hem. She sighed deeply, the sigh of someone who's seen too many complicated situations in retail, and said she'd need to call her district manager. What followed was 30 minutes of standing awkwardly by the customer service desk, while Deborah made phone calls, and my father stood next to me like a silent guardian, his presence alone making me feel safer, and less like I might fall apart completely. Other customers came and went, some shooting curious glances at us, probably wondering what drama was unfolding. Finally, Deborah hung up her phone and turned to us with an expression that was part relief and part exhaustion. Her district manager had approved an exception to their standard policies. Given the circumstances, the clear evidence of ownership, and the fact that the dress had been part of a chain of theft, they would let me have it without charging the $35. She apologized for what had happened, said she couldn't imagine going through something like that, and carefully bagged the dress in one of their large plastic bags. I thanked her profusely, my voice cracking with emotion, and my father nodded at her with the kind of respectful acknowledgement that conveyed genuine appreciation. As we walked out of the store into the parking lot where the November air was crisp and smelled like rain-soaked asphalt, I finally let myself cry again, but these tears were different. They were relief mixed with residual anger, gratitude mixed with grief for everything I'd lost beyond just the dress. My father stood there holding the turntable he'd apparently decided to purchase, waiting patiently while I composed myself, not trying to fix my emotions or tell me it would all be okay, just being present in that solid, unshakable way that made him who he was. When I finally wiped my eyes and took a shaky breath, he spoke. What he said wasn't profound or poetic, but it was exactly what I needed to hear. "That dress belongs to you," he said, his voice steady and certain. "Nobody had the right to take it, and you had every right to get it back. That's all there is to it." Then he paused, looking at me with those weathered eyes that had seen a lot of life and complications, but still maintained a clear sense of right and wrong. "Your sister made a bad choice, Emma. We all make bad choices sometimes, especially when we're with the wrong people. That doesn't mean what she did was okay, and you don't have to forgive her right away, or maybe ever. But don't let this turn you bitter. Don't let it make you stop believing in people." We stood there in the Value Village parking lot, cars pulling in and out around us, the distant sound of traffic on Powell Boulevard creating a constant urban hum, and I felt something shift inside me. My father was right. I was entitled to my anger, to my sense of betrayal, to my hurt feelings. But I also couldn't let this define me. Couldn't let Melissa's choices and Travis's manipulation poison my entire outlook on life and relationships and family. The dress was back in my possession. That was a win, a tangible, physical reclaiming of something that had been stolen from me. The emotional healing would take longer, but at least I had this. My father offered to buy me lunch at a Vietnamese restaurant he liked near the store, a small place called Pho Van that made the kind of soup that could heal a bad day. We sat in a booth with cracked vinyl seats, eating steaming bowls of pho while rain started up again outside, tapping against the windows in that familiar Portland rhythm. He didn't press me to talk about Melissa or Travis or my feelings. He just told me about the projects he was working on in his garage, about a complicated wiring issue he'd solved for a neighbor, about my mother's garden, and how the roses were going dormant for winter. It was ordinary conversation, comforting in its mundanity, a reminder that life continued regardless of personal drama. After lunch, my father helped me carry the dress up to my apartment. He looked around the space, noting the emptiness where Melissa's things had been, and I saw something flicker across his face. Sadness, maybe, or disappointment in his younger daughter. But he didn't say anything critical. He just asked if I was doing okay living alone, if I could afford the rent by myself, if I needed anything. I assured him I was fine, that my job was stable and I'd already adjusted my budget. Before he left to drive back to Eugene, he pulled me into one of his rare hugs, the kind where you can smell Old Spice and sawdust and something indefinably comforting that just registers as Dad. He told me he loved me, that he was proud of how I was handling everything, and that I should call if I needed anything at all. After he left, I hung the dress back in my closet, this time in a different garment bag I'd bought specifically for it, positioned where I could see it easily. Looking at it didn't make me sad anymore, not in the same way. It had transformed from a symbol of a failed relationship into evidence of my resilience, proof that I could face betrayal and still fight for what belonged to me. The dress represented something more now. Survival, recovery, the refusal to be a victim of someone else's bad choices. The following weeks brought an unexpected development. My mother called to tell me that she and my father had driven up to Portland to meet with Melissa, without telling me beforehand because they didn't want me to feel obligated to be involved. They'd asked her to come alone, without Travis, to a coffee shop in Selwood. According to my mother, it had been a difficult conversation. Melissa had been defensive at first, insisting that I was overreacting, that it was just a dress, that she'd had a financial emergency, and I wasn't using it anyway. But my father, in his quiet, immovable way, had laid out exactly what she'd done in terms that made it impossible to minimize. She'd stolen something that didn't belong to her. She'd violated trust. She'd prioritized a boyfriend she barely knew over her own sister. She'd shown a fundamental lack of respect for boundaries and property and family. My mother said that Melissa had eventually broken down crying, admitting that Travis had pressured her to sell the dress, that he'd been having trouble paying his rent, and had convinced her it was the solution to his problems. She said she knew it was wrong even as she was doing it, but felt trapped by her feelings for him, and the fear that if she didn't help him, he'd leave her. It was a classic manipulation story, the kind that plays out every day in relationships where one person exploits another's vulnerability and insecurity. My parents didn't excuse her behavior, but they tried to help her understand how she'd been manipulated and encouraged her to reconsider her relationship with Travis. I wasn't sure how I felt about my parents intervening. Part of me was grateful that they were holding Melissa accountable, helping her see what she'd done from an outside perspective. Another part of me was still too angry to care about her reasons or her regrets. Understanding why someone hurt you doesn't automatically heal the wound. Melissa sent me a long text message a few days after meeting with our parents, apologizing extensively, saying she understood if I never forgave her, admitting that she'd let Travis manipulate her and had made terrible choices. She said she'd broken up with him, that she could finally see how toxic he was, how he'd isolated her from family and friends, and made her complicit in behavior she normally would never engage in. She asked if we could eventually talk, maybe meet for coffee, try to rebuild some kind of relationship. I didn't respond immediately. I needed time to sit with my feelings, to figure out what I actually wanted, rather than what I thought I should want. Sarah told me that forgiveness wasn't required, that I could decide to maintain boundaries with Melissa permanently if that's what felt right. My father said that family relationships were complicated, that people deserved chances to make amends, but only if they genuinely changed, and only if I felt ready. My mother, predictably, hoped we could reconcile because she hated seeing her daughters estranged. Everyone had opinions, and ultimately I had to figure out my own. 3 weeks after getting my dress back, after sitting with my anger and hurt, and slowly processing everything that had happened, I decided to respond to Melissa's text. I didn't say I forgave her, because I wasn't there yet, and might never be. But I acknowledged that I'd received her apology, that I understood she'd been manipulated, and that I was willing to consider meeting eventually, though I needed more time. It wasn't a warm response, but it was honest, and honesty felt more valuable than false reconciliation. She texted back immediately, saying she understood, that she'd wait as long as I needed, that she was getting therapy to figure out why she'd been so vulnerable to Travis's manipulation in the first place. Christmas approached with its usual commercial fanfare, the downtown Portland streets strung with lights, Pioneer Courthouse Square hosting its annual tree lighting ceremony, the Pittock Mansion decorated in period-appropriate Victorian splendor. My parents invited both Melissa and me to Eugene for the holidays, making it clear that there was no pressure, that we could come separately if that made things easier, that the priority was everyone feeling comfortable. I decided to go, partly because I missed my parents, and partly because avoiding Melissa forever wasn't a sustainable long-term strategy. We were family, connected by blood and history, and 2 decades of shared experiences that couldn't be completely erased by one terrible betrayal. The Christmas gathering was awkward, but not unbearable. Melissa and I were polite to each other, navigating around the hurt, like people walking through a room full of broken glass, careful where we stepped. We didn't have any deep conversations or emotional breakthroughs. We helped our mother cook dinner, exchanged gifts that were thoughtful but safe, played Scrabble with our father while rain drummed on the roof of their house. It was a beginning, or maybe a prevention of a permanent ending. Time would tell which one it actually was. In January, I went on a date. Just one date with a guy named Marcus who worked in tech and liked hiking, and had a dog named after a character from a Coen Brothers movie, which felt like a promising sign. The date was fine. Not amazing, but not terrible. And whether it went anywhere didn't really matter. What mattered was that I was trying, putting myself out there again, refusing to let betrayal and heartbreak turn me into someone who closed herself off from possibility. I told Marcus about the wedding dress situation on our second date, wanting to be upfront about my recent past, and he listened thoughtfully and said it sounded like I'd handled a difficult situation with a lot of strength. I didn't know if we'd keep seeing each other, but I appreciated his perspective. Sarah and I celebrated my reclaiming of the dress by having a small dinner party at my apartment, inviting a few close friends, cooking too much food, drinking good wine, and laughing until our sides hurt. During the party, someone asked if I'd ever wear the dress, maybe get it altered for a different occasion or sell it properly to recoup some money. I thought about it, looking at the garment bag visible through my bedroom door, and realized I didn't know. Maybe someday I'd meet someone and want to wear it for the wedding it was originally intended for, even though it would be with a different person. Maybe I'd keep it as a reminder of resilience and recovery. Maybe I'd eventually be ready to let it go on my own terms, which would be completely different from having it stolen. The uncertainty felt okay. I didn't need to have all the answers right now. Melissa started texting me more regularly, not pushing for reconciliation, but sharing small things. A funny meme, a song she thought I'd like, updates about her new job at a nonprofit that worked with domestic violence survivors, which felt significant, given her recent experience with manipulation. I responded sometimes, maintaining a cautious distance, but not completely shutting her out. Our parents seemed relieved that we were at least communicating, even if our relationship looked nothing like it used to. My father told me during one of our occasional phone calls that healing wasn't linear, that some wounds scarred over while others kept reopening, and that I should trust my instincts about what I could handle. Spring arrived in Portland with its usual explosion of cherry blossoms, and people emerging from their rain-induced hibernation, filling the parks and waterfront paths, sitting outside at cafes wearing sunglasses, and looking vaguely surprised that the sun still existed. I got a promotion at work, a small one but meaningful, with a modest raise and more creative control over projects. Marcus and I were still dating casually. Nothing serious yet, but comfortable in a way that felt healthy. The apartment felt like mine now, no longer haunted by Melissa's absence or the memory of Travis's intrusive presence. I'd rearranged the furniture, painted an accent wall in my bedroom a deep teal color, hung new art I'd found at local galleries and markets. One Saturday in April, Melissa asked if we could meet for coffee, and I surprised myself by agreeing. We met at a place in Hawthorne, sitting outside despite the slight chill in the air, both of us wrapped in jackets and cradling warm mugs. The conversation was stilted at first, two people who used to know each other completely now trying to figure out who they'd become in the months of estrangement. She told me about her therapy, about recognizing patterns of codependency and low self-worth that had made her vulnerable to someone like Travis. She'd learned that he was actually married, living a double life, using women for money and emotional validation while maintaining a completely separate existence. The information should have made me angrier, confirming how thoroughly he'd deceived her. But mostly I just felt sad for the version of my sister who'd been so desperate for connection that she'd ignored every red flag. I told her about my promotion, about Marcus, about the ways I'd been rebuilding my life and rediscovering who I was outside of relationships and betrayal and family drama. We didn't talk about the dress directly, skirting around it like it was too raw still to address head-on. But toward the end of our coffee date, as we were getting ready to leave, Melissa said something that felt important. She said she understood if I never trusted her the same way again, that trust was earned through consistent behavior over time, not through apologies and promises. She said she was working on becoming someone worthy of that trust, even if it took years, even if I ultimately decided she'd burned that bridge permanently. I didn't tell her I forgave her because I still wasn't sure I did, at least not completely. But I told her I was willing to keep trying, to keep having these awkward coffee dates, to see if we could build something new even if we couldn't fully restore what we'd lost. It felt honest, which was more than I'd been able to offer for months. We hugged before parting ways, a brief tentative embrace that acknowledged both the history between us and the distance that still remained. My father visited Portland again in May, bringing my mother this time for a weekend trip. We went to the Japanese garden in Washington Park, walking through the carefully maintained paths, admiring the manicured trees and peaceful ponds, the way everything was designed to create harmony and balance. My father didn't say much, never did, but he walked beside me with his hands in his pockets, and occasionally pointed out particular plants or design elements he appreciated. At one point, standing on a wooden bridge overlooking a koi pond, he said that he was proud of me for not letting what happened make me hard or bitter, for finding a way to reclaim not just the dress, but my sense of self. My mother linked her arm through mine and said that sometimes the worst things that happen to us end up revealing our strength, showing us what we're capable of surviving. She wasn't minimizing what Melissa had done, or suggesting it was somehow good that I'd been betrayed. She was simply acknowledging that I'd faced a terrible situation, and come through it still capable of hoping, still willing to try, still fundamentally myself, despite everything. We stood there on that bridge, the three of us, watching koi fish swim lazy circles in the clear water, and I felt something I hadn't felt in months: peace. The wedding dress still hangs in my closet, in its protective garment bag, a tangible reminder of a complex chapter in my life. Sometimes I look at it and remember the excitement of finding it, the heartbreak of the engagement ending, the violation of having it stolen, the vindication of getting it back, It stopped being just a dress and become something more symbolic, a physical representation of loss and recovery, betrayal and resilience, the complicated reality of being human and having relationships that sometimes hurt you and sometimes heal you, and sometimes do both simultaneously. I don't know what the future holds. Maybe I'll wear that dress someday at a wedding that actually happens, surrounded by people I trust, marrying someone who sees me fully and chooses me anyway. Maybe I'll keep it forever as a piece of personal history, a conversation piece, evidence of the time I fought for something that belonged to me and won. Maybe I'll eventually donate it properly, sending it into the world to be someone else's perfect dress, their symbol of hope and new beginnings. The uncertainty doesn't frighten me anymore. I've learned that life rarely goes according to plan, that people you love can hurt you terribly, that betrayal can come from unexpected places, but also that you can survive it all and still be yourself, still be capable of love and trust and hope. Melissa and I continue to rebuild slowly, meeting every few weeks, texting more regularly, finding our way towards something that might eventually resemble sisterhood again, though it will never be exactly what it was. That's okay. We're different people now, shaped by what happened, hopefully wiser and more careful, but not completely closed off. Our parents seem relieved that we're trying, that the family isn't permanently fractured, though they're careful not to push us faster than we're ready to go. As I sit here on a June evening, my apartment windows open to let in the warm summer air that smells like cut grass and distant barbecues, I think about everything that's happened in the past year. The engagement that ended, the dress that was stolen and recovered, the sister who betrayed me, and the father who stood beside me in a thrift store parking lot and helped me understand that reclaiming what's yours is always worth the fight. I think about how trauma and healing aren't linear, how some days you feel completely fine, and others you're ambushed by anger or sadness you thought you'd processed. I think about how I'm building a life that's mine, defined by my choices, my values, my willingness to be vulnerable despite the risks. The dress hangs in my closet, ivory lace and pearl buttons and a small, nearly invisible repair near the hem. It's not just fabric and thread anymore. It's proof that I showed up for myself when it mattered, that I refused to let someone else's terrible choices define my story, that I'm capable of holding people accountable while also leaving room for eventual forgiveness if they earn it. That's what my father understood when he saw me at Value Village that November afternoon, clutching a stolen dress and trying not to fall apart. He understood that sometimes the most important battles aren't about winning or losing. They're about refusing to give up on what matters, on who you are, on the belief that you deserve to have your boundaries respected, and your belongings protected, and your pain acknowledged. Portland continues its rhythm around me. Rain and sun and endless coffee, and people on bicycles and food carts on every corner, and the Willamette River flowing through the heart of the city, carrying stories downstream. My story is one of thousands, millions, happening simultaneously in this place and every place. Stories of hurt and healing, betrayal and recovery, loss and the stubborn insistence on hope despite every reason to give up. I'm still here. The dress is still here. That feels like enough for now. Like the beginning of something, rather than the end. Like proof that even when people you love disappoint you terribly, you can still choose to keep going, keep trying, keep believing that better things are possible even when current evidence suggests otherwise. And maybe that's what my father was really saying when he spoke those simple words in the parking lot, when he looked at me holding my recovered dress and said what he said. Maybe he was reminding me that the world is full of people who will take things that don't belong to them, who will make choices that hurt others, who will prioritize their own needs over basic decency. But he was also reminding me that I have agency, that I can fight back, that I don't have to accept loss passively, or let betrayal define me. The dress belongs to me. Nobody had the right to take it. I had every right to get it back. That's all there is to it. Simple truth in a complicated world. Solid ground when everything else feels unstable. A father's certainty when his daughter needs it most.